Capacity is the biggest bottleneck. Most of the memory manufacturers are all sold out. So until the capacity element is sorted, then we can talk about further elements on how AI workloads can generally fundamentally change what performance really means.
Hello and welcome to Advantest Talk Semi Podcast. I'm Don Ong, and today we're going to talk about from silicon to systems and how the chips industry is redefining competitive advantage. Joining us today is Salah Nasri. He is the author of the book Games of Chips, and he is also the CEO of ISIG, the International Semiconductor Industry Group, an organization bringing together semiconductor leaders across the US, Europe, Middle East, and Asia to foster collaboration and strategic dialogues around the future of the industry. And today, the conversation we're going to have is not just about chips, but about the systems and partnership that is shaping the future of technology itself. Welcome, Salah.
Thank you for having me on the Advantest Semi Talks. Advantest is a vital member of our association. We have 500 members globally, covering the whole ecosystem, IDMs, foundries, design houses, end user. And, without Advantest, there is the testing element, the ATE world won't be as enabled as it is today. So we appreciate the backing and the support that we've had with Advantest for nearly 2 decades now. So we go back a long time ago since the beginning, and it's been a joy for us to grow together with Advantest in the industry. So thank you for having me on this show, Don.
No problem. We're very happy to be part of the whole semiconductor value chain. For decades, the semiconductor industry was driven by a very simple idea: make transistors smaller, faster, and cheaper. And for a long time, that was enough. But today, something fundamental is changing. The industry is no longer competing only at the level of silicon. Increasingly, competition is happening at the level of systems, ecosystems, and integration. So the winners are no longer defined solely by who has the best chips, but by those who can orchestrate design, manufacturing, packaging, software, supply chains, and partnerships all into a coherent systems of value creation. So in many ways, semiconductors are evolving from a product industry into a ecosystem industry. So in this first episode, we will explore how the definition of competitive advantage itself is changing and what that means for the future of the semiconductor world. So for many years, leadership in semiconductors was closely associated with transistor scaling and Moore's law. From your perspective, what changed and why technology leadership alone is no longer sufficient?
Great question. I mean, look, if we go back in time, 20 years ago, right? This is when I came into the semiconductor industry. Still look young, rest assured, but 20 years ago is a different time to be in the game. The answer to your question would have been almost embarrassingly simple. And the answer would be 2 words, Don: transistor density, right? So whoever shrinks fastest wins, right? As you mentioned, and Moore's law was the rule book at that time. And now what you see is that the whole industry organized itself around it. But I mean, you have to take into consideration is what's changed. It's not a fundamental shift. It's actually a transition. And as we've pushed closer to the physical limits, if you look at simple physics of silicon, that single axis race has given way to something far more multidimensional, right? So you have to look at it from today's perspective. What is it about? It's about how well you orchestrate across design, across manufacturing, packaging, software, and where we are in the game, ISIG, and ecosystem partnerships. So what you have to take into consideration is that the companies pulling ahead aren't necessarily the ones with the best individual chip. That's what we're seeing. It's the ones that we've actually built the most coherent system around it. whether you talk about TSMC or Nvidia or Intel or all of these type of companies, there is a constant, and the constant is the ecosystem around it. And the numbers back this up. We specialize in the advanced packaging world, and that market alone is projected to grow, if the numbers are around 25 to 30% CAGR. And that is also taken into consideration that there is a potential reaching limit of the numbers around about 80 to $100 billion by 2030 to 2033. So, this market in specific, if we just talk about advanced packaging, for example, barely existed at meaningful scale when transistor density was the only game in town, Don. And we took a huge risk in totally focusing in this area of advanced packaging 15 years ago. The design houses, they weren't interested in working with us, right? They were, and then all of a sudden, when the AI inflection point came into play, just about post-COVID, every design house is now heavily focused in advanced packaging. So this is an overall perspective, as an example, as a case study, based on what you're asking me right now.
Exactly. And moving along the train of thought that you just mentioned. So today, some of the most valuable semiconductor companies do not necessarily own fabs or equipments or even manufacturing capacity. How has the definition of competitive advantage evolved over time?
Well, it goes back to what I was referring early on. If we look at competitive advantage today, right, it's all about balancing that whole ecosystem, Dom, right? Competitive advantages is, you have the design community with you. You have the foundries, the fabs working with you. You have the packaging. You have the EDA side working with you. The ecosystem perspective working aside with you. That is the competitive advantage that is into play. And, the other key perspective that one needs to take in consideration is there is a talent issue as well, right? Getting the best talent. How do you get the best talent, right? It's now whereby you look at leaders in the semiconductor ecosystem today, more than ever, the personal brand is more than important, right? Why are we doing this podcast is a question that you want to question as well. Why does Jensen Huang jump on every podcast that you can see on Earth? All of these top leaders are on that perspective. So it's, you have two multiple facets in this side. The first facet, Don, is the ecosystem structure. And the second facet is that the perception of leaders today being represented on that perspective. How do we get this knowledge shared? How do we spread the vital element that semiconductors is the backbone of any industry globally in the world? It's still underrated, to be frank with you. It should be even more important with you, Don, right? Of course, now, everyone's getting all huffy puffy because the semiconductor stocks are looking great lately, right? The 2x, 3x. No one imagined that. No one would have pictured that to happen. 5 years ago or 10 years ago, for example. So I think, the competitive advantage is two elements as a recap to conclude on this is one, an ecosystem perspective of solidifying that area. And the other perspective is that leaders today have to work on their personal brand more than ever. And companies need to also solidify their brand's perspective on a global side of things at the end of the day.
Yeah, I like that. I agree with that a lot because as we're moving with AI, Gen AI specifically, things are changing really quickly and becoming so new. And so there's the need for people like us and Jensen to talk more about AI and what AI is going to do for us. So
Correct.
the semiconductor industry, like you mentioned, is an ecosystem. It's probably one of the most globally interconnected industry, right? That mankind has ever built. So is this interdependency ultimately a strength or a vulnerability or both?
Fair question. we have to look at the look at the end. A few forces are converging at once, and I think it's worth being direct and transparent about each of them rather than pointing to a single cause, right? I think first, the cost and complexity of advancing to each new process node has grown ridiculously now. The return on pure silicon innovation is without a fact diminishing for many players today, Don. So you can spend billions, right? Billions chasing a node shrink and see incremental gains when the same investment in packaging or software co-optimization could actually deliver far more dramatic outcome.
I like to twist this around a little bit. So as AI infrastructure scales globally and the technology improve, and you alluded to advanced packaging being the bottleneck, everyone is focusing on that right now. So where else do you think is the real bottleneck? So is it like compute, memory? We talk about energy, packaging, supply chain, or is it the coordination across the entire ecosystem? Where is the real bottleneck?
We hosted the ISIG USA Summit, which gathered the whole ecosystem together, right? What caught me by surprise, I went in there with the same mindset that you basically have told me right now, Don, saying that the bottleneck could be the power perspective, memory perspective, advanced packaging perspective, even the talks of co-package optics coming into play. You know what my biggest takeaway was, Don, from the whole summit that we had in those 2 days? And bear in mind, this summit it only has the leaders driving the R&D roadmap of these semiconductor companies. You'd be surprised what the takeaway was.
What was it?
I'm going to tell you. Capacity. 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 It caught me by surprise. I was like, wow, capacity is the biggest bottleneck. And looking at that situation from a capacity standpoint of view, whether we talk about memory, we can talk about memory, for example. Most of the memory manufacturers are all sold out. They're all sold out to the end of the year. They can't deliver. TSMC can't deliver all the wafers that it wants to all of its customers. Nvidia is frustrated by this situation, right? Because TSMC has to fulfill the other customers, has to fulfill AMD, has to fulfill Apple, has to fulfill Marvell, has to fulfill Broadcom. And these are not small companies. These are titans in the game, right? So, I think the capacity element was the biggest takeaway from the summit that we had 2 weeks ago. And this is the biggest bottleneck. So until the capacity element is sorted, then we can talk about further elements on how AI workloads can generally fundamentally change what performance really means.
Wow, I wasn't expecting that. But okay, that's a really good insight. It's a really, really interesting insight.
Don. If you read, if anybody listens to any of the last earning releases from any of the semiconductor companies, right, the backlogs are insane.
Yes.
The backlogs are unimaginable, right? And let's go a little bit targeted. Let's talk about co-package optics, right? The question: why did Nvidia invest $2 billion in Marvell? Why did Nvidia invest $2 billion in Lumentum? Why did Nvidia invest $2 billion in Coherent? Purely to secure indium phosphide wafers. Capacity. It goes back to capacity again, right? Who would have imagined these indium phosphide companies who are supplying the wafers, even the materials, to be blowing up like the way they are today, right? So if we're finding out solutions on how to make this these bottlenecks sorted, the biggest problem is capacity.
So pushing along this a little bit, because you guys organized a lot of semiconductor executive summits and globally, not just in the US but globally. So are you seeing differences in the US, how the US, the Europe, Middle East, and Asia think about the future of semiconductor besides capacity? That, like you just mentioned, everyone's talking about capacity, but besides capacity, do you see any difference between the regions?
I think now more than ever, semiconductors is without a sovereign initiative. It's very sovereign focused now. And any country that wants to focus on national sovereignty must have some sort of semiconductor ecosystem in play. When we look at it from a geographical point of view, not one country can dominate the whole ecosystem, right? In the US, there'll be the masters at design, without a doubt, from an innovation standpoint of view. Europe will be the masters at legacy node products, whether we talk about power semiconductors, MEMS, or sensors. If we look at Southeast Asia, Singapore from a foundry standpoint of view, Malaysia more so on the assembly and test point of view, on conventional packaging. Taiwan will be one of the key places for advanced packaging and foundry perspectives, because TSMC is there at the end of the day, right? China has to do everything because of the situation that it's in on a global status. Japan will remain the leader in materials, period, right? So every region will have its forte from a strength standpoint of view. And every region needs to find out how to work effectively from a supply chain standpoint of view, right? The Middle East, I mean, we just, I'm talking to you out of Dubai in the UAE. 10 miles across from me is the Hormuz Strait. For example, the impact of just the blocking of the Hormuz Strait has magnificently changed the supply chain element around the global perspective, Don. Whether we talk about the pricing of gas, the pricing of helium, all of these key elements associated in the ecosystem for semiconductors is all going to have an impact. So, geopolitically, for the semiconductor ecosystem to be effective, we have to work in a way of peace between each other and work some sort of coalition between each other. I mean, Don, do you know that the Middle East, the GCC, invested in total, when Trump came here last year, $1.4 trillion in the US data center market? So that 1.4 trillion doesn't just go to the data center only. It trickles down to our ecosystem, because we're the ones who are behind our community, our people that we work with, that we rub shoulders with, that we talk to on a regular basis, are the ones that are behind the structure of data centers today, right? And I'm not going to talk about the automotive side and cellular side and etc. But if we talk about what's the so-called bubble, I won't call it a bubble, but this AI bubble per se, every region around the globe that has some sort of fundamental presence on a global perspective has to find a way to kind of work along with each other, because one way or another, something cracks in part of the global ecosystem, we will be impacted without a doubt.
Yep, I like where this is going. And moving towards the end of our episode 1, and you were alluding to this, but I'd like you to say that in one sentence or two, if possible. If you were advising the next generation of semiconductor leaders today, what mindset shift would you encourage them to adopt in order to succeed in this increasingly interconnected and challenging industry?
The mental shift required here is significant, and I've seen a lot of smart companies struggle with it. That's half a sentence, Don, right? Yeah,
No problem.
half a sentence. I'm counting myself. Look, the old instinct in this industry was to own as much of the stack as possible. Vertical integration as a competitive moat. That logic hasn't disappeared, but it's been complicated by the sheer specialization required at every layer, Don. So no single company can be world-class at EDA or at foundry or advanced packaging or at system software simultaneously. So the question becomes this: is where do you create irreplaceable value? And where do you build deep trust-based partnerships to cover the rest? And I think another question that they should ask themselves, without me telling them the answer, is what's striking is that the most resilient players today are those who are very clear about their role in the ecosystem and very intentional about the alliances they form. So at the end of the day, Don, look, it's not about being the biggest player anymore. Now, today, more than ever, which is why our business is like this as of late, it's about being the most integrated one. That is the key takeaway.
I like that a lot.
Great. You're welcome.
And stay tuned for episode 2.